All right, well, I'd like to welcome everybody to to our webinar on data science for two-year colleges. Just before we get started, we practiced this, but now my screen won't advance. There we go. Just a few notes before we get started. If you could please use the mute button, it's on the bottom left side of your screen. It looks like a little microphone to mute your microphone. It looks like we have about 58 people already on the webinar, and so that will help keep the background noise to a minimum. If you do have questions during the webinar, there's a chat window. You should see a little chat button at the bottom of your screen, and we'll be monitoring the chat window for questions, and we have time set aside for Q&A at the end of the webinar, and we'll be taking the questions from the chat window. So feel free to enter them as you have them into that chat window. And also just to let you know that this webinar is being recorded, and it'll be posted on the project website after they have a chance to get it processed and posted. What we're going to be talking about today is a project that started several years ago at the American Statistical Association with a goal of developing guidelines and recommendations. We saw that many two-year colleges were just starting to explore the role that they might play in educating the data science workforce of the future, but there wasn't a lot known about what kinds of programs might be feasible and what they might look like at a two-year college. So with support from NSF, and we had some additional support from ASA and Booz Allen Hamilton, we hosted a summit in May of 2018 where the focus was on data science at two-year colleges. And I'm going to give a little bit of background on that process, and then we'll be turning it over to Rob and Brad, who will also be participating here. The summit that we had back in May, we had it at Booz Allen Hamilton in the DC area. We had over 70 participants, and we had good representation from both two-year colleges, four-year colleges, and also participants from industry and government as well. We had a few speakers, but we tried to devote most of the summit to group discussions, and the idea was that that these discussions and the input that we got from the summit participants would help us inform the development of the guidelines and recommendations. So the purpose of the summit wasn't to actually write the guidelines and recommendations. That would be an impossible task with 70 people, but the idea was to have kind of wide-reaching discussions about the issues that would help with the development of those. During the course of the summit, we identified three different possible types of programs that would be something that two-year colleges might want to consider. The programs that we ended up focusing our discussion on were the ones that you see here on this slide. The first one that we looked at was the idea of developing a program that would be an associate's degree, a two-year college degree, designed for people that wanted to go directly from the two-year college into the workforce. And the idea behind these kinds of programs is that they would produce what Oceans of Data has coined as middle skills data practitioners. And the idea here is that that data science is typically done as a team, and that there is a role on these data science teams for these mid-skills data practitioners that might include working on data acquisition, data cleaning, and basic data analysis. So they wouldn't probably be leading one of these teams, but they would be a productive member of such a team. The second type of program that was considered at the summit was the idea of an associate's degree designed for people who wanted to do their first 2 years at a community college, but whose intention was to transfer to a four-year data science program. These kinds of programs we found were probably the programs that face the biggest challenges, partly because there really is no good consensus right now among the four-year schools. If you look at the data science programs at four-year schools, they're all over the board in terms of how they mix mathematics, statistics, and computer science. And so that makes it very difficult for two-year colleges, unless they're working in partnership with a four-year college, to negotiate articulation and other kinds of difficulties. And then the third type of program that we looked at the summit were certificate programs. Many two-year colleges were exploring the idea of offering certificate programs designed for people who are already in the workforce, but who wanted to enhance their skills or potentially add data science skills to their skill set. And we found that there were quite a few community colleges that were looking at these kinds of programs, but they were pretty diverse in content and focus because it often depended on what local and regional workforce needs were. Although there were a number of examples based on different areas that included data management, cybersecurity, and programs like that. So we considered each of these three kinds of programs in the discussions, and we broke up into groups, each group being asked to focus on one particular type of program as we went through the discussions. There were a number of questions and issues discussed, and you'll hear more about these. Brad's going to be talking about some of these a little bit later in this webinar. But the kinds of things that were discussed at the summit were what kinds of programs are feasible, what kinds of jobs graduates will be prepared for. An interesting topic was what level of mathematics should be required, and is that different for the three different kinds of programs? Where should data science reside? Typically, at community colleges, there may be a mathematics department. Well, there is a mathematics department, and there might be also a computer science department, business department, and so where should a data science program reside? And then we also talked about some other issues related to how will business and industry react to associate degree as an entry-level position in business and government, and how to form partnerships with local industry, particularly if colleges are considering the direct-to-workforce or the certificate kinds of programs. And Brad will have a little bit more to say about this in a bit. Just a little bit of what happened after the summit. These discussions was really an invigorating summit with a lot of interesting and hotly debated points of discussion. But after the summit, we had writing teams. We had 3 writing teams. Each one had either 3 or 4 people on it, and each team was focused on one of the particular kinds of programs, and they were charged with the daunting task of trying to pull together the discussions and the input that we received from the summit participants. And as I said, we had one team for each of the 3 program types. Each of these teams developed recommendations and as well as curriculum recommendations and sample curricula for their specific kinds of program. And then Rob Gould, who you will hear from a bit later as well, served as the overall editor, and he's the one that took the work of the 3 different writing teams and merged that into the report that we're sharing with you now. We had a draft report that did go back out to the summit attendees, and they were able to review and provide feedback, and then Rob did a final pass where the report was revised based on the input from the writing teams and the summit attendees. So that's a little bit of background on the summit itself and what happened after the summit. To talk about some of the recommendations from the summit, I'm going to turn it over to Brad now and let him take over, and he'll talk about that.
All right, can you see okay here? All good? All right, so what I wanted to talk about here is one of the outcomes of the summit was a set of 7 general recommendations to help us kind of drive the curriculum, the sample curriculum development. So I'm going to go over these 7 recommendations in a very broad sense, and then Rob will go ahead and dive a little bit deeper with the specific sample curriculum a little bit later. So the first recommendation is to create courses that provide students with a modern, compelling introduction to statistics. Obviously, we're working with the ASA here, so it goes without saying that we think that a good statistical foundation is critical here for success in this program. Another recommendation has to do with dealing with realistic problems using real data. And a real advantage to this could come through industry partnerships. So it's one thing to have real data sets and to call problems realistic, but if institutions can develop those industry partnerships and can get authentic problems to work on with their students, that could be a real plus. So when developing projects and things like that, it would be a good idea to try to really partner up with those industry relationships to get that real data and real problems to work on. A third recommendation, this is probably, like Roxy said, one of the hottest topics at the summit, dealing with the levels of mathematics in the program. And it really turned out to define the differences between the three different types of programs. So when you're talking about a certificate program, possibly you don't really need much math at all, right? You're only looking at a few data science courses to go on top of an existing degree. If you're looking at a transfer to a four-year institution, well, that articulation agreement may have requirements that are going to say, look, the student needs to get up through Calc 3 with linear algebra before they can jump into their junior year into this program at a four-year institution. Whereas a two-year associates to work program, you have a little bit more flexibility as you don't have to meet those articulation agreements. But then again, how much math do you want to put in that two-year curriculum when you also are trying to prepare students for the workforce in data science? So that was a big discussion. And I can say for that type of program specifically, the associate to work, I think it was consensus that it really shouldn't go up through the calculus series. And in fact, it might even be a good recommendation to get a little creative with that. So one of the things that came up was creating a customized math for data science course that has a lot of concepts that would be in a traditional four-year program or even graduate program, but just kind of touching on the topics that they might need to see later, taking some concepts from calculus, from linear algebra, from probability theory, and so on. So that's one of the creative solutions that could work for that associates to workforce program. Designing courses so that students solve problems that require algorithmic and statistical thinking. This was really a driving guide for the curriculum, and Rob's going to get more into the specifics on the differences between these two. It's important to expose students to technology tools for data science. Specifically, we're thinking that we would recommend that we require students to develop fluency in at least one programming language for data science and recommend familiarity with a second. And we try to stay away from the specifics here on what language or what tools, because we really think that the institution should really look out at the industry that they're serving to inform that decision. So before a curriculum is developed in terms of what technology will be used, it might be a good idea to do an industry needs survey or audit to figure out what technology the local industry is looking for and then develop curriculum accordingly. So a program in Seattle might look a little different than a program in Texas or Delaware. So that's why we tried to stay away from the specific languages and really just talk about the exposure and the familiarity with whatever ones will be applicable to the local institution. This recommendation also was a hot topic in the idea of ethics in data science. And the conversations went back and forth on should there be a single course called Ethics in Data Science that kind of covers everything all at once, or should ethics be included in every course throughout the program? And I think that's ultimately where we landed, even though both scenarios could certainly be effective. And the last recommendation is to foster active learning, again, using real data and realistic context. And an outcome of this, programs should consider portfolios as summative and formative assessment tools. Additionally, you could also achieve this using a capstone course where students are developing an authentic project that kind of summarizes or encapsulates all of the work that they've done over the previous 2 years. And really the goal of this recommendation is to increase the employability of the graduates of the program. A lot of the research that we did with industry when we said, do you care what degree the students have if they're applying for these jobs? And the feedback that we got was we're less concerned with the actual specific degree, whether it's a master's, bachelor's, or an associate's, and we're more concerned with if the student can demonstrate the mastery of the content, and then they can get the work done. And so we're going to need some kind of mechanism to do that, and a portfolio or a capstone course could be an avenue for that. So those were the general over the 7 recommendations. Now I'm going to hand it over to Rob, where he's going to go more in depth on how those helped us develop the curriculum.
All right, thanks, Brad. I feel like I'm a newscaster. Now back to you. Let me get this started. Okay. All right. So I'm going to talk in a little more detail about some of the program learning outcomes that came out of this the summit meeting. There's a lot of details here, and I'm not going to give them all to you.
Your screen's not shared, Rob.
My what?
Your screen isn't shared.
Okay. Well, thank you. Is that better? All right. Even though we practiced, we didn't practice enough. These learning outcomes, if you really want the details, I recommend you read the report. They're also kind of summarized in the executive summary. So for more details, see the main report. As Roxy described, the writing teams took the data from the summit and compiled them into learning outcomes. And we put these outcomes into specific categories. These categories echo maybe the National Academy of Science outcome categories, but they're different from it because we had different discussions at our summit, I think. I've tried to group them by color here into some sort of categories. There's computational outcomes, which are divided into foundations and thinking. There's statistical outcomes, which are foundations and thinking plus modeling. And then some unique groups, data management and curation foundations. I'll show you those outcomes explicitly in a bit. Mathematical foundations, Brad has talked about, and I'll say a few more words. And productivity foundations, which are kind of the soft skill outcomes. I'll say some words about that as well. I do just want to talk, point out the difference between these foundational and thinking outcomes. The basic idea here is that foundational outcomes are smaller, skill-based outcomes. Maybe they're the atomic units of outcomes within these categories of computation and statistics. Whereas the thinking outcomes are larger skills that maybe require or cross over multiple foundational outcomes or synthesize them in some way. So they're thinking skills. I'm going to show you a comparison between the statistical foundations and thinking, so you'll get a sense of what we mean by that. But before I do, I just also want to point out the statistical modeling categories. This is the category that includes outcomes that deal with learning machine learning, issues of predictive modeling versus inferential modeling, bias and variance trade-offs, overfitting, those sorts of outcomes. We felt kind of deserved their own category, and so we put them in the statistical modeling category. So let me just show you what the statistical thinking and foundation outcomes look like. So the foundation outcomes are on your left-hand side, and I said these are kind of atomic skills, but they're big atomic skills. Produce and interpret data visualizations. As we know, that's quite a task. But nonetheless, what these outcomes are saying is that is a worthwhile skill to be able to produce, perhaps at the request of someone else, and to be able then to make interpretations of a visualization or of numerical summaries, carrying out hypothesis tests using confidence intervals, and being able to investigate and explore multivariate relationships. On the thinking side are some larger order things, starting from the bottom of this list, identifying sources of variability and sampling variability and understanding the role those plays in making conclusions about the summaries and the visualizations that you produced earlier. Recognizing when questions can and can't be answered with data and what data might be appropriate for answering those questions. So again, the purpose here was to kind of separate the higher level thinking skills from, I hate to say lower level because they're pretty high themselves, but for the more atomic foundational skills. I wanted to say, as Brad said, a little bit about mathematical foundations. I'll just say a little more. We borrowed somewhat from the National Academy's recommendations, which were calculus, matrices, and basic linear algebra, and basic probability. They went a little further, but for a 2-year program, we felt this was in fact more than enough. One thing we really wanted to specify was that when it says calculus and basic linear algebra, it does not necessarily mean the traditional calculus sequence, which is often a 2-year sequence. As Brad pointed out, precisely what math is going to be required in the program depends a lot on the type of program and the location of the program, where it's situated. But it also depends on the target population of students, and the employer's expectations for those students. So we wanted to emphasize, say, a certificate program could have a very high level of mathematics. It might be attracting engineers from a local, from local employer who are looking to improve their data analytics skills. Or it might involve people who have not taken anything beyond algebra, and that even was a decade or more ago. So institutions need to think very carefully about whether math is a barrier of entry that can be lowered or leveled, particularly taking into account that employers, the particular position, since there's such a variety of positions in data science, might not require much math at all. So one thing to consider is a Math for Data Science course. Brad emphasized this. This is a course that would emphasize mathematical modeling as it applies to connections between the real world and data and mathematics. And this course would probably have a stronger emphasis on linear algebra than it does on calculus. There's a great example of this on the Mathematical Foundations courses from the Park City Math Institute curriculum guidelines. If I remember correctly, Andrew Bray and Albert Kim were the primary authors of this particular course as it's given here. And so that provides a really nice understanding of what a year-long Math for Data Science course might look like, and perhaps is a good starting point for some people if they're trying to think carefully about how to tailor mathematics for their program. And I mentioned the productivity. The name of this category was somewhat controversial amongst us, but I could come up with anything better. But these are the so-called soft skills. And we kind of recognize that every program says that communication and collaboration is an important outcome, but the signal we heard from potential employers at the summit was that these are particularly important in data science because, as Roxy mentioned, often this is done as a team, and so collaboration and communication are essential. Another discussion that came up at the summit was this idea that it's not enough to just throw students into situations in which they have to communicate and collaborate, but that these need to be explicitly taught because they need to be practiced and they need to develop good habits. So that last leads us to this somewhat vaguely named habits of mind. And by this, we just wanted to include outcomes that were more vague and general in nature and spoke to attitudes that we would hope graduates have, and that would include, an understanding and aptitude toward becoming lifelong learners, because technology continuously changes, and graduates of these programs need to understand that they therefore also need to be continually learning. We had hoped they would come out with an empirical mindset, problem-solving mindset, and those sorts of attitudes and approaches towards problem solving. Brad mentioned ethics, and so I'll just say a little bit more about this. This was discussed quite frequently at the summit. We strongly encourage programs to encourage issues involving ethical considerations in all courses in which it's appropriate, and that would include many, if not all, computational and statistical courses, maybe fewer in the mathematical courses, but even so. An alternative was having a course called Ethics that addressed these explicitly, And we think such a course is a great idea, but shouldn't exclude including these and embedding them in other topics so that students have repeated exposure and see it discussed in multiple contexts. You'll hear the word capstone a lot, you already have. And again, we felt that the capstone course provides an opportunity for students to reflect on how ethical issues might interact with the project that they're working on in a capstone environment. So a little bit, we have the same learning outcomes for all three types of programs, for the transfer, for the direct to work, and for the certificate programs. But clearly we don't expect the same level of exposure in all three of these types of programs. So inspired by the Oceans of Data report, we tried to describe the level of depth in each of these outcomes in terms of exposure, working knowledge, and mastery. So exposure is kind of the least, the lightest touch on these outcomes. It's kind of at a bare minimum, something where students have seen the content, they know what it is, they can give a quick definition or description of what it is, but they haven't worked with it. So if we're thinking of a programming, if one of the outcomes, as one of the outcomes is to acquire, a programming language, then an exposure to a programming language might simply mean that students know what it is and they can contrast it to other languages that they've learned, but they haven't programmed in it. Whereas working knowledge is deeper. In working knowledge, students have had multiple exposures in the curriculum to this topic. They've practiced it, and they're able to apply this knowledge to solve routine problems. They might need assistance in novel situations. So again, if we're thinking of programming as a way of understanding this level of depths, people with a working knowledge in a program language are doing coding. Maybe they're coding kind of everyday quotidian sort of problems. They may be looking up on Stack Overflow or using the help menu a lot. And it may be that they're still acquiring knowledge in this area, but they are comfortable working in this programming language. And the highest level is mastery, and this is where students have a fairly deep understanding. So again, if we're talking about a programming language, they're very comfortable programming in this. They can program in novel situations. They can create program algorithms they have not seen, more complex algorithmic structures. In a larger sense, mastery means that they have transference skills on this concept. They're able to apply it to a new context or a problem they haven't seen before. So clearly, mastery is going to require quite frequent multiple exposures throughout the program, and almost certainly will require engagement in, if not a capstone project, then some other long-term real problem-solving environment. So this slide, I apologize, it has lots of words, and this is just, we wanted to show you one example of what the outcomes actually look like. These outcomes are under the data management and curation category, and we chose this category to show you because this is one of the categories of outcomes that show stronger differences and help you see the differences between the three types of programs. And I think maybe what's a little startling at first, at least to some viewers, is in this case, the programs intended for transfer students have a much lighter level of depth than the other programs. And there are many reasons for this. And one reason is that programs for transfer students are by necessity somewhat constrained in what they can offer, because they have to make sure the students articulate at the four-year institutions that they're sending the students to. And that means there's less room in the curriculum. A positive way of doing that is that two-year degree programs for to-work students have a lot of flexibility and can really tailor programs more appropriately towards data science outcomes. Another reason for transfer programs being somewhat lighter is that presumably they're transferring into four-year programs in data science related fields. So if not data science itself, then maybe computer science or computer engineering or statistics, in which case there's more time. They'll have an additional 2 years to acquire more depth. This outcome table also illustrates a little notation we used. If you look down, I hope you can see my cursor, but at the DMC.F, manage databases outcome, we use a slash notation here to indicate that there may be a range of depth depending upon, precisely what sort of degree is being crafted here. So a two-year program, direct to work, that's specializing in preparing students for database management, of course, would require mastery. But the program might instead be preparing students who will work with people using databases, and maybe they'll need to write the occasional query to a database. So they'll need some working knowledge. They'll need to be comfortable interacting with databases, but not need to have mastery level knowledge. So there's room for flexibility in many of these categories. So I know there's a lot to read here, and I'll just use this as more data that you need to read the final report itself. I have a couple of more slides to show you before I turn it back to Brad. So achieving masteries, I think, as I said before, is going to require multiple exposures and a capstone project or some other extensive work. And this theme came up again and again in the summit discussions. So we want to show you one actual curriculum. So all of these outcomes, to achieve them, you need to create courses. They need to fit in a two-year program or less if you're designing certificates. So we created sample curricula. These are meant to be proof of concepts or prototypes and not templates. And so this is a proof of concept for a direct-to-work program. So it happens over 4 semesters. It's only 3 courses. Actual programs could have more, but we felt that these 9 courses that you see are 12 courses, multiplication. These 12 courses would achieve the outcomes of a direct-to-work program as we listed. The proof that they would achieve them is not shown here, but again, I'll refer you to the report, which has links to outcome maps that show you how these courses achieve particular outcomes. 2 things of interest. One is in semester 1, we mentioned both an Intro to Data Science course and an Intro to Statistics course. So the Introduction to Data Science course is meant to provide a kind of soups to nut overview of a data science problem to students. Maybe they're not engaging in all aspects of that problem solving, but they're understanding how it's done and what's involved in the process. And we would hope that colleges and two-year colleges will find this a very popular offering beyond the program it may be designed for, and maybe a great opportunity to kind of hook more students into the data science program. The other thing I want to point out is this is an example that only mathematics in this program occurs in the Math for Data Science course, which again would be a course tailored to applied mathematical modeling and helping students understand the role of modeling in that. So that is a sample curriculum. I should add that we did not provide sample curriculums for the certificate programs because we felt those were just too varied for a sample curriculum to be of value. So with that, I'd like to turn it back to Brad, who's going to talk about, I have to figure out how, there we go, that's going to talk about some of the longer range outcomes that we had.
Okay, thanks, Rob. So if you work at a two-year institution and you get to the point where you're actually developing curriculum and courses, you should consider yourself very lucky. There are a lot of hurdles that you have to go through to even get to that point with any one of these 3 types of programs. And I can speak from experience firsthand what some of those hurdles are, but they also came up throughout the summit as well. So just as an example, I'd say 5 years ago when I, along with a small team, proposed the idea of associate's degree in data science at my 2-year institution, the first question that the board asked was, well, how many other programs out there are there like this? And we said, well, there might be one in the entire country, and that was pretty much the end of that meeting. So now we're growing in numbers a little bit. There's a lot more interest. So it's a little easier sell, and schools are interested in developing these programs. They know that there's a market for it. And that's, one of the great outcomes of this summit is that we're able to use this now, this research, to kind of support our case when we go to two-year institutions and say we're interested in starting programs for this. So some of the specific questions that came up, Roxy mentioned some of these already. But the obvious one is a data science program even feasible at your particular two-year institution? So that's going to require some work. You're going to have to do some convincing. As we know, there's not a whole lot of consensus on exactly what data science is. So you have to be able to convince the board or whoever's making these determinations that it's relevant for your institution and it's feasible and that it will benefit your students. Part of that is to go out and to look at the local industry that your institution serves. And specifically, what minimum degree requirements are their job postings? If all of the industry around the institution is advertising for a master's degree required for any data science position, that could create a problem when you go to propose this program. So that's going to cause you to, need to reach out to some industry partners to kind of really dig deep to see why those minimum degree requirements are there. Is an associate's degree in data science actually creating a new role? And we kind of touched on this a little bit before, this idea of the data practitioner or middle level skills or entry level data scientist, whatever you want to call it or define it. Is this a new role? And if so, are the human resources offices that are creating these job postings, are they aware of this new role? Our industry, do they even know how to articulate this new role in their job postings? So that's something that you really need to unpack through basically an industry needs kind of survey beforehand to say, if we graduate our students with this degree in this data science program, they can actually get jobs. So you're going to have to do some convincing there. Aside from what type of program, whether it's certificate, associates to work, or transfer, in what department will the program operate? And I think Roxy touched on this a little bit. Is this going to live in the business department as kind of a business analytics program? Is it going to live in statistics? Or can it be its brand new department that kind of operates on its own? A big concern, and this came up quite a bit at the summit, is will there be qualified faculty at the two-year college level available to develop and to teach these new courses? If so, if not, will the institutions have the means to go out and hire groups of new faculty to accomplish this goal? And finally, as data science is obviously an emerging field, how will curriculum be continually evaluated and redesigned to meet changing needs? This is not going to be a program that you're going to design and you're just going to let ride for 7 or 8 years. This is going to need some upkeep, and you're going to need to touch base with industry partners. And so will this require an advisory board, or how will you ensure that the curriculum is consistently being updated to meet the needs so that students are able to find employment after graduation? So now I'm going to go ahead and pass it back to Rob so he can tell us how we can continue this conversation and we can go and answer all of these challenges.
All right, thanks. Play the current slide. Here we go. Now I'm sharing, I think.
Not yet. Oh, there it goes.
There it goes. All right.
Okay. All right. Well, so I've been monitoring the...
Wait, we're not quite ready, Roxy.
I was just going to say.
Oh, but maybe... Okay, go ahead.
So...
Oh, well, so I just wanted to add, Roxy's going to keep us going with questions in a second. We do want to keep in touch. We formed a Google discussion group. If you'd like to join that discussion group, please contact Steve Pearson at this email address. We believe you can also join via this link below. And so welcome you to do so. At the webpage in which you first learned about this webinar, we will have the audio and slides posted from this talk, and you'll also be able to access the forum from there. I do want to mention that there were a lot of people very strongly involved in this project, and take a moment to acknowledge them. We had a steering committee the slide has as the title is if we were all on the steering committee, but the first bullet item are the steering committee. These people were very actively engaged in developing and designing the workshop, and I think almost not all but could attend, but all who could did. And then there were writing teams, as we said. These were also very active for quite some time after the workshop, taking the data from the workshop or the summit and putting it into the document that you have now. The summit participants, we were really astonished and overwhelmed in the most pleasant of ways by the number of people who came. We initially saw this as a small workshop of 20 or so people, and the demand was just so great. We enlarged it to get wider voices, and so I think we had well over 80 people intending to go, and 72 or 3 who actually were able to come. And rather than give the list on these slides, please see on the website, the amstat.org website, a list of all the participants, because they were all very active, not just in the summit itself, but in preparation for the summit and in discussions that have evolved since then. So with that, I will turn it over to, or let Roxy take control.
Okay, well, so I've been monitoring the chat box for questions. A couple of people mentioned interest in the Oceans of Data description of the middle skills data practitioner, and I'll point out that that Paul posted the link to that in the chat box. So if you scroll back up in the chat box, you'll find in 2 different places a link to the Oceans of Data, the work profile of a data practitioner link. That document was something that we considered heavily, especially during the writing of the 2-year to work programs recommendations. And so it's a very interesting document, and I would encourage you to take a look at that as well. So let me start in terms of the questions. There's a question from Roger, who says, Roger's a computer science prof at a 2-year college, and they were looking at the Google Docs that had the sample curriculum and saw the Intro to CS class, and asked a question about what kinds of language that should be based on. They said they're designing a new course, but that was using a block language like Mindstorms, but wondered if it would be better for students preparing for data science to use a language that could be used to work with databases like Python or Ruby. And so I thought I'd open it up to Rob or Brad for comments on that.
Yeah, so that's a great question. I mean, I think to go in a little more detail, what came out of the summit was the notion, we talked a lot about how much programming do they need to learn and how much programming can they learn in 2 years. And one thing that came out of that, and a signal we also heard from the potential employers, was that they would like students to know one language very well, and they would like them to have working knowledge of another language. So mastery of one and working knowledge of another. The secondary language was so that they would learn how to learn, because probably whatever language they are learning, they will not be using in 5 or 10 years' time. We recommended, given the interest of time, that mastery language be one that's used in the data sciences. So something like Python or Ruby or R, we felt should be that primary mastery-based language.
Okay, Brad, anything to add or?
Oh, sounds good.
Okay. All right. John McKenzie mentioned that in the description of the associate degree, I think the associate degree to workforce, there were a lot of topics that were listed, and wondered which of those would be taught in a well-designed applied statistics course and which would not. So, for instance, I think John was referring to the slide that said that they would work as part of a data science team with duties that might include things like data acquisition, data cleaning, database management, combining data from different sources, producing data visualizations, and basic data analysis. And so my take on it is actually those skills are scattered throughout that set of 9 courses that Rob showed, but I'll let Rob and Brad weigh in on that as well.
Yeah, so I guess I would second that. We did feel that institutions will have to wrestle a little bit about where they're going to address these outcomes. And certainly the so-called second course in statistics may be one place in which they're already covered. What our concern was that we wanted to encourage programs to have an introductory statistics course, I should say 2-year programs, not necessarily certificate programs, but that introductory statistics course, to make sure it has a strong exposure to exploratory data analysis, design of experiments, and some of these other topics that are sometimes not covered in introductory courses.
Okay. All right. We have a couple more, but I would encourage you, we do have some time, so if you have other questions, please enter them into the chat box. Another question came from, which is, I think, an interesting one, be interesting to get your take on this, is from Don Davis, asks, would it be helpful for community colleges to form separate departments of statistics/data science that are separate from the traditional mathematics department? So I'll let.
Yeah, I can touch on this one real quick, and then I have a little personal experience in that we basically had a very similar discussion here recently, in that initially we were going to probably set up our program within the business department. But it turns out that a lot of other departments across the institution, including engineering, nursing, bioinformatics, really wanted a piece of this as well. And so what we found was that if we set this up within the business department, we lose a lot of the flexibility to serve those other departments. So now we're actually leaning towards creating an independent, almost statistics/data science department, so that we can create those opportunities for other departments to come into the program, get what they need, and then jump back out. In addition to developing that straightforward data science degree pathway. So that just gives us a lot more flexibility to meet the needs of the entire college, as opposed to just an individual degree program such as data analytics. So that's definitely a good question.
Rob, did you have anything to add? Nope. All right, thank you. So a question from Margaret asks, can you address how to best recruit students to a new program which they may not have a lot of prior knowledge about?
Yeah, I guess I'll let Brad answer. Brad, do you have any?
Recruiting is definitely not my strong suit, but what I would say is that one of the missions that we're going to have with this program is to not have a lot of barriers to entry. We do not want to have extensive prereqs for this program. It's not going to be a kind of program that students have to test in to or go into a pool before they're allowed admittance into the program. That's just specific to the students that we serve, and the mission of our college is that we want to have create this opportunity for as many students as possible. So, I'm not sure about the recruitment. I know that we'll definitely be talking to the high schools and partnering there, as well as industry, to see what other opportunities are there. But I know that we're going to create a program where there's not a lot of barriers to entry just across the board.
I guess I could add a little bit to that as part of the context that's surrounding this, that I think many of you know as much or more about than we do, is that there's a tremendous demand nationally for these skills, and there's been various places have talked about how there just doesn't seem to be the academic infrastructure in place to satisfy this demand, and so the 2-year colleges are being looked at as a place that could meet this demand. So this is kind of not addressing a recruitment problem, because this all assumes that demand already exists, and what you seem to be asking is how to create awareness of this among students. But I think another thing that came out of our summit was how important it is to work with local employers and make sure that that programs are producing graduates who can be employed by those local employers, so that that may assist in the recruitment, is the sense that there's successful job placement and that it's something that's part of the community.
And I would add also that at this summit, there was a lot of discussion about the possibility of introducing data science for all type courses, or it was also described as joy of data type courses, as just a a course that would be open to anybody that was interested in taking that, and that could be a potential source of students coming into the program if they have a really good experience with a kind of a general education, quantitative joy of data type course. Let's see, another question. Ashley asks, would you recommend a second course in statistics for any of the three programs that we talked about at the beginning? Thinking that the intro stat course or a first course in statistics is ending at inferential statistics. So what would there be a second course that would follow that?
I'm not sure if we're recommending that, but it certainly could work, and particularly if that course was geared towards statistical modeling, and particularly if the modeling course included working with real data and included predictive modeling and either statistical or machine learning, however you want to call it. I think that would be one approach.
All right, well, this is a hard one, and one that we grappled with, coming from Bruce. Bruce says, I'm a four-year college statistics data science professor advising some local community college faculty about their interest in doing something around data science. Something that comes up is recalcitrant faculty, retraining interested faculty, resources for retraining. What do you advise for a community college department that can't hire but wants to move in this direction?
Well, that was a really tough problem. As I recall in the summit, we just kind of acknowledged that that's a really tough problem. And it's going to be a big issue, is that, as technology changes, we have to kind of build in ways for instructors and professors to learn about changes in technology. So I don't know if we have a good answer for that one.
Yeah. What are you planning to do, Brad, since you're trying to put this in at your place?
I think the initial approach is we're going to have to kind of piecemeal something together. We have interested faculty from computer science, from business, from engineering, and from math stat. They're going to kind of work together to kind of hopefully set things up. And then going forward, like I said, if we could set this up as an independent department, then we have to make decisions about where people are going to land. But I think one of the ideas that we had was, again, you'll hear this a lot, but just working with local industry to kind of partner with them. And we may even have to go in our recruitment for adjunct faculty from them to kind of set up courses where we can join with them to develop curriculum. So that's something that's on the table as well.
Okay, well, Dave Fluherty asks, did we discuss linking to internships, or are most students already working full-time, which would preclude working with another company?
Yeah, we did discuss that. I mean, and I think it depends on what the situation is at the two-year college. Some programs, all the students might be currently working, and others, the internships might be valuable. What we emphasized was the need to provide them with authentic problem-solving practice. And so whether that comes from an internship or a capstone course, there may be a variety of ways of addressing that.
All right, let's see. We have Martha asks, are there currently any curriculum developed for that intro data science and analytics modeling, etc.? Is there a site where it can be centralized for timely and standardizing course development? In other words, do you know of places where you can see sample curriculum?
Yeah, so that's a good chance to point out that part of our project was to assemble resources to help two-year colleges. And so in the report, you'll find a number of links, because there are a number of data science programs at two-year colleges, and there are a number of intro to data science courses at 2- and 4-year colleges. So we tried to provide links to all the ones we found out about. And so that the report is a good place to start your search for that, I think.
All right, Don asks, what role does simulation-based inference have, if any, in data analysis and in data science? You're muted, Rob.
Yeah. So I think in our when we talked about the data science, the Intro to Stats course in the document, we mentioned explicitly that it would be very, very helpful if simulation were used, simulation-based inference were taught within that course, perhaps over the more traditional approach. Because it is an example, Brad mentioned that one of the outcomes, one of the goals is to combine algorithmic and statistical thinking, and simulation-based inference is a great example of that combination, that synthesis.
All right, well, I think there's two more questions that are actually looking at the same thing, so I'm going to make our last question a combination of these two. David says, some firms seem to be looking for the data science unicorn, you know, PhD in stat with 5 years experience, et cetera. If so, does industry really want something with an associate degree? And then Barbara says, we have IBM near us in Poughkeepsie, and they apparently only want people with at least a master's degree. So this is an issue that we talked about quite a bit at the summit. Do Rob and Brad, do you want to address that?
Yeah, we definitely saw the same thing with our initial feasibility study and going out and looking at those job postings and doing an audit on those. That's definitely what we saw. And then when we actually contacted the human resources department that was kind of behind that posting, we couldn't really get a straight answer as to why that degree was there, that degree requirement. Then we took it a step farther and we reached out and interviewed the actual people working on the data science teams at the same industries and sat down and had some focus groups with them. And in their discussions, they also didn't understand where the master's degree requirement was coming from. They were happy to talk about the skills that they were looking for. And then in talking with them and saying, you know, if these skills to a certain degree can be achieved within a 2-year associate's degree, is that something you're interested in? And across the board, they said, yes, definitely. So there would seem to be a disconnect between the job posting degree requirement and what we were hearing from the data scientists in the field. So that's the evidence that we had to take with us to kind of support our case of moving forward with this, with the associate's degree.
Yeah, I guess what I'd add to that is, again, we're back to the Oceans of Data report, and also maybe their entire website is, you know, they're spending lots of efforts on better understanding this issue, and they do have some more concrete examples of industries that are looking for associate degrees or certificates in this area. But I would like to think we're in a time of transition, and you know, 2-year and 4-year colleges and universities are going to have to play some role in educating employers about what they can do, and especially 2-year colleges. A common theme was that many employers underestimate just what 2-year college students can do. And we have to find ways of bridging that gap where 2-year colleges are better able to communicate to local employers just what their students can do in 2 years. I think maybe some places are using data science as a monolithic term, but within that monolith, there's many areas of specialization that may not really require the degrees that they seem to think it's requiring. So, you know, it is an ongoing process, and there's no easy answers to this issue right now, I think.
I would point out that the National Academy's report on opportunities in data science makes a case for data science professionals at all educational levels. And so that's another resource that would be worth checking out as well. All right, well, finally, I think we're going to wrap up now. There were a couple questions about whether the slides would be available, and we'll collect our slides together and post them at the website, where you'll also find the webinar recording. And with that, I think we will thank you all for attending, and look forward to hopefully seeing you at future webinars.